My thesis is the work of Ida B. Wells is essential in understanding how black women resisted the institution of Jim Crow and the patriarchy. B. Wells was born in 1962 in Holly Springs, Missouri. From a young age, both her parents had emphasized the importance of education and the value of standing up for what you believe in. At the young age of 14, both of her parents had suddenly died from yellow fever, and instead of seeing her family split up, she decided to take upon herself the role of primary caregiver for the rest of her 6 siblings. She had this to say about the situation, quote, "I said that it would make my mother and father turn over in their graves to know their children had been scattered like that, and that we owned the house, and if the Masons would help me find work, I would take care of them. I took the examination for a country school teacher and had my dress lengthened, and I got a school 6 miles out in the country." She was forced to grow up at an early age and take care of her siblings, and this would shape the rest of her life as she would soon move to Memphis, Tennessee, and continue her education and continue to be an educator. In order to fully understand and appreciate the work of Ida B. Wells, I feel it's important to give some brief context about the political and social landscape that she endured for much of her adolescent life. So shortly after she was born, we have the ending of the Civil War, which brings us into the age of Reconstruction, which was a period of hope because we had, with the 13th Amendment that frees the slaves, the 14th Amendment that grants black people citizenship, and the 15th Amendment that gives black men the right to vote, we see our first black senators and black House members in Congress, which was a very pivotal moment in American history. But as we see in history, when there's a progressive movement, progressive period of time, there often is a regressive movement that goes against the work of the movement that just happened. So in this context, that regressive movement was marked with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, which basically, in short, there was a tight presidential election between the Democrats and the Republicans, and in order to consolidate the win in the election, the Democrats secede to the Republican Party under one condition, that they remove all Union troops from the South. And so with the removal of the Union troops that were upholding the law, we enter a period of lawlessness in the South, where the disenfranchisement of black people is starting to begin with black codes, poll taxes, literacy tests in order to vote, and other means of intimidation through violence, the lynching of black people. All of this is happening at the end of Reconstruction, where essentially the Republican Party abandons black people in the South and leaves them to fend for their own. And I feel like this is important because the work of Ida B. Wells goes to fight against this, in fighting for equality for black people, fighting for the right to vote for black women, and calling out America on its promise of equality. And this was a very important moment in history.
In March of 1892, 3 black grocery store owners in Memphis, Tennessee were murdered by a mob of white men. Lynchings like these were happening all over the American South, often without any subsequent legal investigation or consequences for the murderers. But this time, a young journalist and friend of the victims set out to expose the truth about these killings. Her reports would shock the nation and launch her career as an investigative journalist, civic leader, and civil rights advocate. Her name was Ida B. Wells. Ida Bell Wells was born into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi on July 16, 1862, several months before the Emancipation Proclamation released her and her family. After losing both parents and a brother to yellow fever at the age of 16, she supported her 5 remaining siblings by working as a school teacher in Memphis, Tennessee. During this time, she began working as a journalist. Writing under the pen name Iola, by the early 1890s, she gained a reputation as a clear voice.
Ida B. Wells was part owner and full-time editor of the Memphis Free Speech. She had gained a reputation for criticizing local governing bodies for lack of resources for African Americans. For example, she criticized the city school board for lack of employment of efficient teachers and poor school buildings for African American children. Though after the lynchings of her three close friends, she decided to report the incident and report future lynchings. She would be ran out of Memphis because of the great influence she had. In retaliation to the lynching, she urged black people to move out of Memphis. Quote, "The power of the state, country, and city, the civil authorities, and the strong arm of the military power were all on the side of the mob and of lawlessness. Few of our men possessed firearms, and our only company's guns were confiscated. And the only white man who would sell a colored man a gun was himself jailed and his store closed. We are helpless in our great strength. It was our first object lesson in the doctrine of white supremacy, illustration of the South's cardinal principle that no matter what the attainments, character, or standing of an African American, the laws of the South would not protect him against the white man. The free speech supported by ministers and leading businessmen advised the people to leave a community whose laws did not protect them." She would go on to lecture throughout Europe to garner attention to the horrific crimes committed against black people in the South. She did not mince words and spoke out relentlessly, which was often criticized by white men and black men alike, especially those more conservative black leaders in the civil rights struggle. Ida B. Wells can be described as a person before her time. Much of the critiques of Wells was based in traditional patriarchal culture of America during this time. Women lacked the right to vote along with other means of political and social agency. Patriarchy is described as a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. Women were expected to act and speak in a certain manner deemed acceptable by men. Wells did not fit into this mold. She was accused of speaking like a man and was considered not feminine. She was considered radical for her rhetoric of self-defense. Quote, "A Winchester rifle shall have a place of honor in every black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give. When the white man who was always the aggressor knows he runs a great risk of biting the dust every time his Afro-American victim dies, he will have greater respect for Afro-American life. The more the Afro-American yields and cringes and begs, the more he has to do so, the more he is insulted, outraged, and lynched." End quote. This is an example of the tone that she carried that would ostracize her from the civil rights movement in her later years of life. But she did have support from fellow black women.
Their well-known slogan captured the communal spirit of the women's club movement, lifting as we climb.
By the end of the 19th century, African American women, as part of the club movement, were fighting against all of the injustices that African Americans were experiencing. But one of the most important issues that they worked on was anti-lynching.
In the 1890s, the pioneering investigative journalist Ida B. Wells lectured widely through the British Isles, shining a light on the horrifying injustices that black Americans were suffering under Jim Crow.
There were prominent men who opposed what she did. A woman talking so frankly, they thought it was unfeminine, they thought it was problematic. And so when she was getting flack from men, it was the women's clubs that did support her.
In 1895,
Wells, like many other black women, saw the need to speak up for themselves. Caught in between two movements, the feminist movement, which excluded black women, and the civil rights movement, which prioritized black men and neglected black women, was not meeting the needs of black women. In order to combat this, black women decided to organize politically with the Women's Club movement, which fought against lynching, fought for the right to vote, and greater equality in civil rights leadership. Worms formed a black women's political club called the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was the first of its kind. She also helped found the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. Wells worked tirelessly to uplift black people and, most importantly, black women in the face of vast prejudices.
And public would follow their example. Back in the U.S., she didn't hesitate to confront powerful organizations, fighting the segregationist policies of the YMCA and leading a delegation to the White House to protest discriminatory workplace practices. She did all of this while disenfranchised herself. Women didn't win the right to vote until Wells was in her late 50s, and even then, the vote was primarily extended to white women only. Wells was a key player in the battle for voting inclusion, starting a Black women's suffrage organization in Chicago. But in spite of her deep commitment to women's rights, she clashed with white leaders of the movement. During a march for women's suffrage in Washington, D.C., she ignored the organizers' attempt to placate Southern bigotry by placing Black women in the back and marched up front alongside the white women. She also chafed with other civil rights leaders who saw her as a dangerous radical. She insisted on airing, in full detail, the atrocities taking place in the South, while others thought doing so would be counterproductive to negotiations with white politicians. Although she participated in the founding of the NAACP, she was soon sidelined from the organization. Wells' unwillingness to compromise any aspect of her vision of justice shined a light on the weak points of the various rights movements and ultimately made them stronger, but also made it difficult for her to find a place within them. She was ahead of her time, waging a tireless struggle.
Ida B. Wells was a fierce activist and never compromised her character in the face of white supremacy, patriarchal politics, threats on her life, and harsh criticisms. She did all of this while being a great mother to all of her children. She fought hard and should be remembered as a person who defied the status quo and spoke with great conviction despite